There are so many of us committed to improving the lives of the youth in our communities. The In It for Youth podcast is a place for us to come together, from professionals who work with and serve youth to those that champion issues affecting children, to community advocates and stakeholders, and insightful young minds too. The In It for Youth podcast is a tapestry of voices united by a dedication to youth well-being and empowering the young generations of today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Jamie Gale, and I'm so glad you've joined me on this team that is in it for youth. Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm looking forward to today's conversation so much. It's a topic that everyone has heard of, but unless you're really immersed in it, it's really unlikely that you understand the nuances of it. And I know my guest today will shed really helpful light on it for all of us. Today, we're talking about giftedness, and I'm joined by expert in the field, Mark Talaga. Mark is the owner and director of the Center for Identity Potential and has been counseling gifted individuals for over 10 years. He is highly respected in the field of gifted counseling and has published numerous articles on topics related to giftedness and counseling. He is a sought-after speaker and consultant who provides training and consultation services to schools, universities, and mental health organizations throughout the U.S. Mark's career has taken some really fascinating turns. He is a former video game professional, and he utilizes his knowledge of gaming and technology to create a strong relationship with many of his youth clients. Mark is also the host of the newly launched podcast, Hopelessly Gifted. Through his own personal struggle with executive functioning, validating his giftedness, and finding purpose and meaning in this world, Mark has developed an expertise in the education and skills necessary to help gifted children activate their potential and live more authentic, fulfilling lives. Congratulations on all of your impact on youth well-being, Mark, and welcome to the podcast.
Oh my gosh, thanks for having me.
All right. Typically, I start these conversations with finding out about the guest's career right up front, but I think we need to back up a little bit first and talk about giftedness. We've all heard the term. We all know people who've been labeled in this way, but the prevailing sense from outside of the community is basically like, oh, they're really smart and they need harder classes. But from getting to know you and your work, I understand that this is really an off-track description. So can you fill parents and educators and everybody listening in on what giftedness is, looks like, all that jazz?
Oh, I will do my best. Yeah, gifted is a funny word. It's got a lot of feelings behind it for people who hear it. And it's not a perfect word by any means. The short and sweet answer is giftedness is really just your typical human development, but in some level of an extreme. So it can be in anything. Like you could be, a gifted, yes, academically speaking, intellectually. You could be gifted as an athlete. You could be gifted as somebody who, can drive a backhoe really well. So, there's giftedness is just when somebody in some aspect of their life is demonstrating something that is well beyond the norm, well outside of the norm. Sometimes we like to use the term deviance, and people don't really like that, but on some level, that's exactly what it is. You're deviating outside of the norm. And then on top of that, when you have this level of deviance, when you have these extremes, it can be balanced on the other side with areas of vulnerability, of lack of development, underdevelopment, or on some level, you're in the norm, but compared to other aspects of yourself, which may be more on the higher end or higher scale, there's large gaps in your profile. When I guide people to understand giftedness really well, they really need to understand the idea of asynchronous development. The idea that as they develop as a human being, it's not all happening all at once, or my executive functioning and my math and my reasoning and my vocabulary are all developing in a tight cluster. It could be all over the place. And so a lot of people will say, well, my kid's really struggling and they're really all over the place. And so I don't really know if they're gifted. I'm always like, they are, because if you're having that level of scatter, that level of, I don't know what to do with this kid, you're probably in that realm. Now there's always, nuance and caveats to that. But the idea is if you think on some level there's some giftedness going on because you're not really sure how to describe it, you're probably correct.
Huh. Okay. All right. Well, that's helpful. And I know we're going to dive much more into the topic, but I would love now to turn to your current work. So you own the clinic, you're counseling. Kind of fill us in on what buckets of work you do. I know all of us in this field dabble our hands in a lot of different things, but could you give us a picture of what your current work looks like?
Absolutely. So, the Center for Identity Potential is first and foremost a counseling center. And we're there to specifically counsel people in the gifted world. And that doesn't mean you have to be gifted in order to see us. We'll see anybody. But the idea is we are trained in what it means to counsel to that deviance we talked about. Because anytime you have somebody that is outside of the norm, you have to have some sort of specific methodology, paradigm that fits them. And with gifted people, no two are created alike. And so you have to know how to work with people that are all over the place, people that are really complex. So that's where we really pride ourselves, is we work very well with complexity. And within that complexity, we've created a lot of services that meet a lot of those needs. So it's, yes, individual counseling, group counseling, family therapy, things like that, but also executive function coaching, parent coaching, academic support, not necessarily tutoring, but how to teach kids and adults what it means to really understand your learning profile and how that translates into producing work that may not be happening in that person's life. We do trainings. We try to help, spread the good word about what it means to really work with these kids and how to do it effectively. We never want anybody who works with gifted kids to feel like they're overwhelmed or they're doing it all alone. And we try to create some resources like the podcast to meet even more of that need. We have a great center, though, some incredible counselors that work with us here. And yeah, I'd say that's us in a nutshell.
So you touched a little bit on what this could look like. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about how does this show up in kids' lives? So even if you think about it at the elementary level or maybe at teens, so if we compare kind of the elementary age and teens, where does this label, is it a diagnosis? Is it a label? Like, where does this label of giftedness come from? Is it just a feeling that parents have and say, I think my kid might fit this? How does one know whether they fit into this category of giftedness that could benefit from your services? And how does a parent or educator know that someone fits this descriptor?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it depends on who you ask, really. For some people, it's truly this number, right? Oh, you have to have a certain threshold on an intelligence test, and that's the only way you qualify as gifted. I don't really buy that. It is a little more anecdotal. It is a little bit more of a gut feeling, a cluster of symptoms that you start to see. So some pretty broad strokes examples. As a younger kid, you have a kid who's whip smart, school is no problem, but they struggle greatly with things like transitions and executive functioning, and they don't know how to tie their shoe, even though technically they should be at an age where that milestone should be completed, where they have incredibly high areas and levels of interest. But then on the flip side, yes, they're struggling in some way that seems a little bit more strange compared to how intelligent the kid usually is. And I don't care whether they take a test or not, that would qualify, right? And as you get a little bit older, if these issues of asynchronous development aren't really addressed, yeah, it can start to turn into some more psychological symptomatic things, depression, anxiety as they get a little bit older into the teenage years and beyond. My personal specialty, besides working with kids in video games, which is part of my past life that comes into play in my work, is like really bright kids that zipped through school and then they got to college. And then on some level, the demand got so high and those vulnerabilities that were never really addressed in the asynchronous development create a situation where they drop out, flame out, shut down, and feel like they can't do it. And that's how it can appear as people get older. And even in adults, right? Giftedness doesn't go away. I had a good friend of mine. She's like, well, I used to be gifted. Oh, I'm used to. Yeah, that cleared up. You took some medicine. That's good. But it can appear in, difficulty with relationships, difficulty with processing, difficulty with certain other aspects where, you just kind of know you're a little different. You don't really fit into the norm as it's prescribed in the world. So for me, if you want to work with our center, that is good enough. You don't have to have any really qualifiers. And a lot of our kids that come to see us have really been through the ringer. They've seen 2, 3, I got a guy that's seen 10 different therapists. And the idea is they've never really found somebody that can really get to the root of what it means to be an asynchronous complex individual and how you actually have to deal with those issues. And so really the buck stops with us and we say, no, we're going to be the ones that really help you navigate that and understand that.
So when these individuals are moving through the world, on first glance, what do parents, educators, other therapists, how do they approach it? And that is misguided, it sounds like, when it doesn't really address all of the different aspects. Is that through diagnoses? What is the first line that ends up happening with these individuals who are gifted?
Usually what you have is you have parents that are struggling to figure out answers. And they're going everywhere. They're like, is it ADHD? Is it autism? Is it depression? Is it this? Is it that? Is it a medical issue? And so when you have parents kind of going to try to figure out all these different aspects of it, and they're trying to get the school to get on board to help out, and they just feel like they're not getting all the pieces connected, like that's your sign, right? Because you're dealing with something that's more complex than you realize. And the reason like normative therapy, which is a wonderful tool and everybody should have some access to it, doesn't typically work is because the psychological industry is really trained on working with just very specific things like symptomatic issues. Like, okay, you have anxiety. Well, let's teach you how to treat the anxiety. Let's teach you how to breathe. Let's teach you how to, manage your emotions and things like that. But at the root of it, you have these really big gaps where a kid who maybe has really low processing speeds struggles to sit in a classroom where a lot is coming at them all at once, and it's going too fast for them in a sense. Not that they can't handle super advanced material, but it's like it's overloading them. But because they're so smart, they know how to just bank on their natural intelligence to kind of get by. So a lot of these kids slip through the cracks, right? Schools will say, well, they're doing well. Their grades are good. So what's the problem? But when that kid gets home, parents are like, it's meltdown city. They're fighting me on everything. It's explosiveness. My mentor, Andy Mahoney, he once told me that if you have really huge tantrums from kids, explosive tantrums, that's giftedness right there. It's potential. It's emotional potential. It's potential in the kid to try to create some sense of control over the world, but they don't know how to do it. And it comes out as this really reactive thing.
So, the parents are kind of at their wits' end. They feel like they're seeing a side of the kid that the school is maybe not seeing. And so they go to seek out, you said, normative therapy. And so they might get a diagnosis. And I know from our time talking about your work prior to this recording that you said something that was really interesting. And I'd love to shed a little bit more light on it. And that you said that one misstep you see is that people get to the point of the diagnosis, like you mentioned, the ADHD, the anxiety, the autism, and they kind of stop there. And they kind of use that as the answer, right? Like the meltdown is at home because the child has autism, or, they're not doing their work because they have ADHD. And I guess, where does the truth of those diagnoses overlap with your work? You had an interesting perspective on it, and I'd love to shed a little light on it. So let's say the child is diagnosed with XYZ. How do you recommend families or gifted individuals see that clinical diagnosis? And what do you think people are getting wrong there?
Right. So diagnoses are a wonderful thing that can breed relief, understanding, this feeling of like, oh, finally I can understand things. And so, they serve a wonderful purpose that we really need to utilize. The problem is when you have somebody that is a really complex case, typically it's not one thing, right? So in the gifted world, there's this term twice exceptional. And so what it was originally designed to do, and it's a great term on some level, but it was originally designed to say, okay, there's these kids that are super smart. However, they have a learning issue that gets in the way, and you have to treat both. The problem is these kids are more like 10 times exceptional, 10E, right? And so it's like, oh, well, they're struggling in class and they can't sit still. So let's lean towards an ADHD diagnosis. And for some kids, that might be perfectly fine. They get what they need. The treatment for ADHD works great and they're good. For other kids, it's like, it's not getting better. There's still a struggle. And so for me, I'm always like, well, they're missing something there. And we can't just stop at the one label. So our practice prides itself in going through a very rich assessment process, an evaluation process, where a large majority of our clients come in, or we recommend that they have full neuropsych evaluations done. And we want as much information as possible. I'm saying every little thing we want to see, not just what relates even to their symptoms. Because the more you dive in, the more you realize there's these other little areas that gifted kids tend to overcompensate for that get missed. And so again, my recommendation is when parents feel like, okay, we got a diagnosis and the dial doesn't seem to be turning. Your first gut should be, we're still missing something. But for parents on their own, that can be a very difficult thing to navigate. It's like, what is it? And if you have people that aren't involved with giftedness, they may send you down a path that's not so great. And so we try to guide people in our expertise on knowing what a lot of these symptoms look like. A quick example I think is an interesting one is when kids have auditory processing issues. So auditory processing is interesting. It's not that they can't hear. They would pass a hearing test, no problem. It's that they can't take the language that they're hearing and code it in a way where it's really making sense in an organized way. And so a kid that struggles with auditory processing, you could give them a list of 5 things to do, and then they do one of them maybe. And then you call them out on that, and they say, you never told me. You never said that. And then the parents are like, well, my kid's a little manipulator liar. And, I don't think they'd say that directly. But,
well, they might.
Yeah, they might. They have. When they're missing something, that kid's ability to actually take in auditory input at that level is really hampering their ability to do whatever the task is. Now, of course, here gets where it gets more complex. If it's an area of interest or something they have expertise in, all that gets bypassed. So parents will say to me, well, no, he can hear just fine because he plays these video games and he's getting tons of information and he can recite it back to you perfectly. And I'll be like, that doesn't matter, because in certain contexts, everything's about context, that struggle still exists. And so we still have to evaluate for it. And so diagnoses are great, but it's not the end all be all. A lot of people lately are very into the idea of ADHD autism combination diagnosis, where that explains everything. And I do believe it overlaps with a lot of what goes on in these complex kids, but I still don't say, well, it stops there, because then it becomes this, oh, well, I have this ADHD autism diagnosis, so I'm not able to do these things. When it could very well be you have a vulnerability in an area you weren't aware of. And if it's dealt with and supported and scaffolded for, you actually could become excellent in certain areas of your life. So as I'm talking, you can see how it gets really in the weeds and you can feel a little lost by it all.
But I think that's really important, because I do think that, and I'll share, like in my own family, I have kids with diagnoses that, I think some people do view as the limit, right? Like it's the answer. Okay, they can't do this or they won't be good at this because of that. And just through the work with their service providers and their therapists and their amazing teachers, we've been really lucky in our school district to have some really phenomenal teachers. They have seen those as maybe helping to create a shared language about patterns and trends, but we've been able to move through sort of some of the plateaus in skill by really recognizing where the gaps are. Now, from the outside, that family members, other community members, other people, they might not understand, and they might see, oh, well, why? When I see the child, they're great. They're totally successful. They can show up at that family function and put on a face and, make it through. But I know what's going on for them behind the scenes, underneath, and how much work went into that. And then what's needed to, quote, recover from that, so it is so complex. And I really liked one time we were talking and you mentioned about and you touched on this earlier in our conversation today, the downstream impact of moving through the world with these challenges. Like you said, you're hopelessly gifted, right? We'll talk more about your podcast in a minute, but the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons to having these skills, and then of course deficits as well. And you talked about not just the impact on the child's self-esteem, but also on the family function. That's not to be missed, to see how much this impacts. It's not just about being great at one thing. It has so many impacts downstream. What do you see if these people go through life and, like you mentioned, they get to college and they can't be successful, or, the job field and they can't be successful? What happens for these individuals that struggle in this way, and for the families?
You're really touching on a lot there. I'm really glad you're bringing it up, because that is the heart of my work. Because what I really see is a lot of pain behind all that. It is not, oh, can you achieve something or not? It is really the idea of people feeling like they can do more, but they have no idea how to access it. They have no idea how to activate their potential. And that creates a lot of trouble. I'll do a quick left turn for a second, because a lot of the issues that parents come in with is, my kid can't socialize. They don't know how to be social. And 9 times out of 10, if I put that kid in a room with other kids of like mind and like ability, socialization is the most natural thing in the world to them. They're able to info dump on people that love it and kind of respond back. And all of a sudden, yeah, socialization isn't an issue. But what they don't understand is why that's not happening at all aspects of their life, why it's a struggle in their workplace. And so people start to foreclose and shut down on these possibilities for themselves. Well, I just can't make friends. It's just going to turn out bad. I've had too many failures with it, right? Or I can't create a relationship for myself. Or, I don't know how to work in a field that I love and would love to see myself in because I've never really addressed some of these vulnerabilities. And so a lot of people start to put up walls and limit themselves and keep themselves in very safe spaces around what they can and can't do. And unfortunately for these people, they are still human beings who have aspirations and dreams and hopes for themselves. But because the world isn't really built for them directly, it's more built for the average, which is what it should be. They don't know how to first differentiate themselves and say, here's how I'm different. Here's what I need to know about myself. Here's where I struggle. And then support that or scaffold for that and say, now here's how I'm going to integrate back in knowing these things about myself. And it can be a very tricky, painful process. And so you're right, when other members of the family that don't really get it start to put their value system in place around what is happening or not happening with this kid, then all of a sudden, parents can feel invalidated about, well, maybe I'm not doing a good enough job. Maybe I'm crazy. We have a saying in our practice, and this is kind of a gendered saying, but it's always trust the mother's gut. If mom is coming in and she has a gut that something's wrong or something's just different or something needs to be there, I always go with that. I'm like, you're right. Something is off, and we're going to help you figure out what that is. So that there is this sense of, okay, I know what it is now, and now I have to create strategies for how I protect my kid around that while still having these relationships with outside family members, right? It's not always easy.
No, it's not. And talking about the gifted individuals' inner world, that the parents' inner world where they're trying to navigate this, it creates so much stress. And yeah, it's like, why can't I figure this out? And other people are assuming that we're not being strict enough or we're being too strict or whatever it is. And there is probably some of that too. We're just figuring out our parenting journey as well, but we're unsure where to push and where to accept. And so I love that your work supports the whole family and the educators because, classroom teachers are so overloaded with so much,
yeah.
right? And you got 25 kids in the classroom and 15 of them have some sort of, outside the box notes, a 504 IEP. How does giftedness fit into the approach of working with schools, right? It's not DSM diagnosis. So how does a family whose child really does need additional things in the classroom or accommodations, how do they approach the school and have that conversation?
You're opening a can of worms,
okay.
Jamie.
Okay,
I mean, it's a good one though. It's really because it's important for a lot of people. Well, I'll put it at this. If you look at like a bell curve, and on one end you have developmentally delayed students, right? There is training, there are certificates, there is master's degrees, there is paradigms and methodologies surrounding how to work with those kids to provide their development a way to move forward. You do not have that on the other end as much as we should, because gifted education is still special education. It needs to be differentiated on some level, but we can't differentiate for every single kid in a 25 kid class. And so part of the problem is on a higher level, teachers aren't trained. Schools aren't trained. They don't really get what it really means and how giftedness really presents itself. And so it always feels like it's a game of let's respond to when the incident happens and then try to fix from there. So, on a higher level, that's part of the problem. On a more concrete level for parents, sometimes you just have a great relationship with the teacher. You can get what you ask for. It seems to work for the kid. You're all good. Sometimes that works out. For a lot of parents, they don't have that. And one of the best ways I would say is that you go through a process of working with a counselor or somebody that's a professional working with gifted and have them evaluate, hey, is testing necessary? Is this a thing where the kid's ready to get some testing that we can have and then bring to the school as hard data of really good, like, here is what we're dealing with. You can see on some level they're in the 99th percentile for this, but do you see how here they're in the 12th percentile? That is more important than anything that we need to understand about this kid. And whether we do it perfectly or not doesn't matter, because once that kid feels a little understood that, hey, you kind of get me, you're not going to force me or push me or coddle me on the other end of it, there's a lot of therapeutic help with that. But that's very overwhelming for parents because you're dealing with politics and systems and hierarchies, and you may get that one person in the school team that goes, well, I don't see that, so I don't think it's a problem. And you don't know what to do with that. You don't know how to appropriately challenge it. So a lot of the other work we do is we go into schools with people because it can be very difficult to navigate. And maybe a more simplistic level, you have to have a team. You have to create your village of people that understand your kid and are there to advocate in a way that's getting everybody to work together. Because when I go into school meetings, my goal isn't to make demands of the school on what they need to do. My goal is to say, what are you guys up against? Where are your challenges? What are you struggling with? What do you want to be able to accomplish with this kid? So that we can all get on the same page of what they're really up against. I want everybody to be like, yeah, now we get it. Now we're okay. All right, let's try this. Let's try that and go forward.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned that once the child feels understood, it's also the educator or I work in informal education. I run summer camps and after school programs. And it's the same, right? When we can understand more about why a child is, showing up in a specific way in the program, in the camp, in the classroom, it's so important. It's so important to understand why. This wasn't on the topic of giftedness, but I will just share a little anecdote here. I run summer camps and school break camps, and we had this absolutely incredible kid who was part of our program who was so sweet and adorable and enthusiastic. And then once in a while, when the game would kind of elevate and we were getting more active, there would be this huge physical lash out. And then a moment later, this child would be like, wait, whoa, what did I just do? And so, we're trying to balance okay, we only have this kid in our program for a short amount of time and they can't be hurting other kids, even though, kind of came out of nowhere. And so once I was able to go to the family and say hey, we're seeing this. On one hand, we can't have your kid hurting other kids. We're going to have to send them home. But do you have any recommendations? And then they were able to share so much information about what they do and when this kid is starting to escalate, what they do, and it wasn't even negative escalation. It was just higher energy, kind of what they do. But once we were able to understand, then it was oh, okay. Well, then we're going to start with a visual schedule at the beginning of the day. We're going to have them pair up for another counselor instead of a camper when the energy is higher. I guess this is my plug to parents that sharing more with the people in your kids' lives is so incredibly helpful. It might feel, I know people are worried about labeling their kids or giving them a stigma. The behavior will stigmatize them much more than the understanding of why they're acting that way. And then families whose kids are presenting with gifted tendencies can utilize people like you and your team to understand more so that then they can communicate with the schools and the camps and the programs that their kids are in. And so it just creates a much more harmonious flow of things.
Oh, I love that. And Jamie, you're one of the good ones because, not a lot of people would go to that level of saying, hey, what's going on here? How do we help this kid? Because they would make it behavioral or they'd get afraid and they'd say, well, he's not ready, so he can't come, without giving some sense of, okay, maybe he's not ready now, but let's learn more about it and how do we navigate it? And a lot of parents I know that are listening out there have PTSD around trying to advocate for their child because it can get shut down, it can get dismissed, or it can be used in a way where they're like, well, we tried what you said, it didn't work. So, and it can be very scary for parents to advocate, but you're 100% right. The more information people have, the better. And a lot of people don't want to hear that, but luckily there are people out there that can handle it and don't have ego about it and can say, oh, okay, yeah, all right, let's try that. And then the other important part I want to highlight in what you did is you prioritize the relationship, because that is number one with a bullet. Before we introduce any sort of behavioral intervention, you better have a relationship with that kid.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the biggest things we ask of schools, we go is, who is this kid's person? Who does this kid go to when everything falls apart that absolutely has their back? Because when you have that in place, that's one of the best things you can do for a child.
It's really true. And creates just such a better relationship and potential for everybody benefits when you take that extra moment. And, the other thing I see is that teachers will take, a quick, and this is not a knock on teachers, educators, because they're dealing with so much, but they have to make assessments quickly about when a parent does come to them with, okay, here's the thing about my kids, here's what makes them different, here's what makes them unique or challenging, whatever it is,
Right.
then they don't see those things in the first 5 minutes. The educator doesn't. They're going to pin it as like, oh, this parent is cuckoo. This is a parent issue, right? But I do find, and this is through my parenting work and in my current work as the professional in the situation, that even if the information isn't clearly relevant right away, it's better to make it a project that you're working on with the educators or with the camps or with the whatever the group is, rather than wait till it becomes a problem and then try to come at it from a crisis point. And so I think getting the information, seeking out the answers, seeking out the resources in advance, and then approaching the school or the camp or whatever it is with that information, even if it ends up not being necessary, is just such a better approach than not. Well, so speaking of resources, I'd love to talk about your new podcast, Hopelessly Gifted. Full disclosure, this is how I know Mark. In addition to hosting this podcast and running my youth serving programs, I am the owner and executive producer of the podcast network Lit Path Studios. And I help businesses start their own podcasts for their own businesses. And that's how I was connected with Mark. And we've been working on this podcast. It's phenomenal. The first episodes are out right now. You should for sure check it out because it's already such a rich resource. And I know he has some amazing plans for the show. But I'd love for you to give our listeners a little look into what is Hopelessly Gifted, why the name Hopelessly Gifted. I know you do a deep dive on your first episodes on this, so people should check that out. But can you give us the abstract version of the show and why and all of that?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Absolutely. Now, I'm going to say one quick thing before we get into this is that, as a gifted person myself, the idea of creating something has always been like a podcast has always been something I cared about, but I would never, ever be able to do it without Jamie. Because and this is the God honest truth, because that's the kind of support I need. What you provide for me to be able to make this happen is the only way that would have happened. So I just, I couldn't do this without you, but I really appreciate you and all that.
Well, I've been really enjoying working with you on it and excited to see all the impact you're going to make. So it's been really fulfilling for me as well.
Oh, good. And so, Hopelessly Gifted, the title to me has two meanings. It is a podcast on all things gifted, talking about some of the topics even we talked about today, but it's ideally it's a resource for parents, educators, or gifted people themselves to understand more of the complexity and understand some more ways of how to move forward when you're starting to feel stuck. On one level, I think a lot of the gifted world out there tends to deal with giftedness as this wonderful thing, which it is. There's joy in it, but it's like, that's great. It's acceleration. They're so smart. Look what they can do. My kid could read at the age of 2 and they're going to go to Harvard and they're going to save the world. And then these kids come into my office and I see pain and struggle and frustration and on some level, hopelessness. And so my podcast wants to talk to that side of things, of the people who are like, yeah, there's the good things, but on some level I'm struggling. Some level I want more support because it starts to feel hopeless. And then the other definition is that you are who you are. When you are gifted, that is just who you are. It is your human nature. It is how you were made. It is the way your brain is wired. And there's no way out of it. It's hopeless, right? So you are hopelessly gifted. And part of that comes with a level of acceptance about what that really means. Because when you can accept yourself and all the differentiation and complexity, you have a lot more sense of empowerment on what you want to do in this life. Right. So I'm really excited for it. I get to interview some really fascinating people. Ultimately, I really want for people who listen to the podcast to come in with burning questions, the questions of I can't get my head around this thing, around my kid, around giftedness, around the way schools are, whatever it is, because that's where I can really start to attend to some of the need out there of what people are after.
And you're definitely accomplishing that. One of the things that you said over and over in our work developing the podcast before you started to hit record was that you really want to give people hope. While they have to accept where they are, you want to give parents and gifted individuals hope. And you do that through your resources and your just deep knowledge and understanding of it. I have learned so much about the world of giftedness from our work on your podcast. And I know, I'm in these Facebook groups, these parenting Facebook groups, and people are always asking questions about, my child is this or that. And, and I'm like, just wait, there's a resource coming.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
I'm excited that it's out there. So You've told me that the show is not Hopelessly Gifted is not a 101 course, right? Or it's not intended to be a 101 course. You will do some intro level things, but you're really diving deeper in. So what are the ways that you're kind of taking it from like a basic understanding of giftedness, which maybe this episode will serve more as, and what are the ways that you're taking it to like the next level on your podcast?
Well, it starts with, again, that burning question, that area of, I can't get my head around this. And we start to go into all the complexity, all of the components that go into it. So, at our work, and this is a little kind of psych nerdy stuff, but it's like we have a systems approach where we're looking at every single system in that kid's life that they come up against and how they're impacting that child's development and growth. And I'm talking like, your neurophysiology, of course, your vocation or job, which is typically school for these kids, your family of origin. But I want to know about your religion. I want to know about the actual physical environment they're in, socioeconomic status, race, gender, all this stuff matters. So when you take like what seems to be a simple problem of why won't my kid do homework? Why is it pulling teeth? You really get to start at that simple level of getting a better understanding of, okay, well, what else is really going on there? And what are we not assessing for? And what might we be missing? It starts simple and then just goes down a rabbit hole a little bit. Now, my ideal reaction from listeners would be that they have a little hope, for sure, always, but that they're pleasantly overwhelmed. That they feel like, whoa, like what? I feel a little anxious about how much there is, because that's actually closer to the actual experience that you and that kid are going through, that it isn't a simple fix. And kids don't like when you present their issues as a simple, well, why don't you just do this? They don't need the solution. I'll guarantee it. They're smart enough to know what the solution should be. It's more about why they can't get there that we start to dive into in these episodes to give parents a little more context and a way forward so that their prefrontal cortex, their executive functioning starts to snap on and say, oh, you know what? This is an area we need to dive down that we haven't really explored yet as a way to better support the kid.
I love it. Well, congratulations on the launch of the show. I know it is going to make a huge impact. We will link the podcast in the show notes of this episode, and everybody should check it out, because if it's not in your immediate family, it's definitely in your extended family or in your community. And understanding giftedness is something that, I've benefited from in my work with Mark over the last few months. And I know that everybody will too. Our listeners are youth serving professionals and parents. And so this is something that can benefit everybody from understanding. So we will link all of that in the show notes. I want to take a little bit of a swerve here. You own your own business. You own the clinics. Now you're the host of the podcast. You do a lot of work in this way. And a person doesn't make it this far into a career where they're not just clocking in and clocking out for someone else's job. The business doesn't make it this far without not only being excellent at the craft of counseling and understanding the gifted, but also having a really solid business foundation. You're doing a great job at both sides, and everybody that makes it this far into a career working for themselves does. So do you have any tips for someone who's listening that, has a lot of talent and knowledge in a youth serving area and wants to turn it into a career or start a business? Do you have any just tidbit of advice for someone out there?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing you've got to recognize is, can you identify the need at a very specific level? Can you see that there is a need that is unmet? Because some people are like, well, I want to help people, so I'll just be a counselor. And they kind of go through a typical path, which for some people, that's exactly what they're going to do. And they're going to do it really well, and they're going to help a lot of people. But for others out there that are wanting to create something, that usually comes from an area of potential that you're identifying a need that hasn't fully been addressed. And then, like you said, you've got to be excellent. And so my advice to people is, don't worry about if it's going to be this huge, massive success or not. That shouldn't ever be your focus. Like what my podcast does or doesn't do doesn't really matter to me. What I need to focus on is that I do it to the best of my ability, and I keep incrementally getting better every time. And I stay in some sort of process that has feedback that allows me to do that. And I'm looking right at you, Jamie.
I'm on it.
Because and that's the thing. And a lot of people struggle with the feedback part, because they'll hear criticism and they'll take it personally, or they'll start to devalue, oh, maybe this idea isn't so good, rather than saying, I need to grow and I need to continue to grow. And I need to continue to stay on top of things so that I can still meet that need at a level that most people typically don't. And the other idea that I would say is I don't really believe there's any sort of competition out there for when you're starting something. There are other people that work with Gifted in my world, even in my area. And guess what? There's enough for all of us. And what they do is different than what I do because they are different than me. And so our expression of how we help people is unique, and it identifies with certain people and not with others. And so never feel like that you're, oh, I'm just doing what everybody else is. Because if you stay true to your own uniqueness and your point of view around the need, you will find success.
I love that. And regarding the feedback, I am on it. And kudos to you because you do take feedback very well. And thank you for letting me push you. So I second all of that. All right, Mark, my last question for you is if you could wave a magic wand on behalf of kids in 2025, what would you wish for them? And what messages would you tell them?
Oh my gosh. Follow your curiosity. I think that was one of the best things I ever learned, was that when you are trying to build something, it's not about envisioning the final project. Start with where your curiosity takes you. If you can follow that, it's always going to lead you somewhere new and create new awarenesses around it. So anytime you just feel even that slight sense of, I wonder what this would be like, try to follow that.
I love that. I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Mark. I loved our conversation as always, and I know the listeners will benefit too. Please tell everybody where they can reach out to you if they want to learn more about your counseling. We'll link your podcast in the show notes, but yeah, like drop your handles. We'll put everything in the show notes and link it all there.
Sure. Yeah. You can find our Center for Identity Potential at centerforidentitypotential.com. You can reach out to us through the website. If you want to follow the podcast, you can follow us on Instagram at Hopelessly Gifted, and same with Facebook, facebook.com/hopelessly gifted. And, I hope you find me one way or the other, and just know that, our job isn't to say, oh, you fit the bill and now we can work with you. Anybody that's looking for guidance, help, some support, even if we're not the ones to bring it to you, we don't leave you hanging. We want to make sure you're getting what you need. So yeah, hopefully they can find us.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, we will make it as easy as possible. Link everything. Thank you again. I really enjoyed our conversation. And to all the listeners, we'll be back next time with another inspiring interview. In It for Youth is a Lit Path Studios production. Music is by Inspiring Audio and Pond 5. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And to learn more about this show and all other shows on the network, visit www.litpathstudios.com.